Hello my dear miniature friends, I'm Flo and you are watching TITUS Painting Studio. Welcome to episode 3 of Road to Ranges of Shadowdeep. This time I don't have a tutorial for you, but I would like to give you a small update on what has been added to the collection. I would also like to explain what I have done and how I did it. And there is also a second small part, this beautiful box here. Northern Folk Rabble from Fireforge Games. We'll look at it together today. I got it cheap in a sale. So, have fun watching and see you later. So, let's have a look at the terrain pieces. I'll zoom in a bit so you can see everything clearly. As you can see, I haven't reinvented the wheel. I turn everything around a bit. So we really only have very simple ruins here. Forest ruins that are completely overgrown with grass and moss. As you know, I have built terrain before. I showed that in episode 1. Generally speaking, I have to say that I'm not much of a terrain builder, but always had a focus on painting figures. I was always a bit impatient, and that's also what the terrain pieces looked like. But this time I said, come on, take your time and try out some new things that you might not know yet. And that also includes material from the model making sector. When I still was a student, I couldn't afford to buy this more expensive stuff. I always tried to solve the problems with paint alone, so to speak. Back then I usually just glued sand onto surfaces and then painted it to simulate plants. But for this project I used static grass and tufts, as you can already see. But let's start at the very beginning. First I took XPS Foam. The first terrain piece I built for the set was this one. First, I started cutting small bricks out of the XPS foam. And I didn't do it with the Proxxon hot wire cutter because on one hand I'm pretty lazy. On the other hand, I like it when the stones look irregular and not too uniform. And since these are ruins, I found a more rugged and broken appearance pretty fitting. That's also the reason why I wanted to start with ruins. These are simple pieces to build, so you can do relatively little wrong. As you can see, they are also crooked. I also tried to structure them a bit later, but not really here yet. With an aluminium ball with the so-called universal structurer. I also rubbed the bricks a bit in my hands to make them a little bit more structured. So I started by gluing them together with PVA glue. It was a pretty wobbly affair at first. This ruin is now only bricks in one row, but later I also built 2-row pieces. When the PVA glue was still wet, I wondered if it would hold, but fortunately it has become super hard and stable. Well, not super hard, but enough. On the bottom you can also see coffee stirrers. You can get them for free at McDonald's, for example, as you probably know. This time, however, I refrained from taking a handful of McDonald's coffee stirrers with me and instead ordered them in an exemplary manner from a catering supply store. And, small tip for you out there, you don't risk getting banned from McDonald's. I also broke the sticks a bit and cut the edges irregularly with a knife. I also used the wooden sticks that are lying around everywhere on the streets at New Year. But these here are still from Sylvester 2019, but in general it's always a good idea anyway to pick them up because on one hand you are out there in the fresh air, and on the other hand you're doing something good by taking the sticks off the street, and at the same time you also get cheap crafting materials. So I first assembled the piece and glued some sand onto it with PVA glue. You can see this here. Somehow I bought bird sand here and I think the grains are a bit too big. It looks a bit strange. I don't know. I actually wanted to use soil first, but I would have had to go back to the garden and I was just too lazy. So I'd rather use the material I have within reach. After assembling, I let everything dry thoroughly. When it was ready, I simply primed it with a mixture of cheap black acrylic paint, PVA glue and water. I applied 2 coats of primer by hand. The PVA glue also ensures that everything dries out a little more firmly and becomes more stable. For once I didn't paint the terrain pieces with cheap acrylic paint, but with the normal acrylic colors that I also use to paint the figures. I know it's way too expensive, but I thought it would be nice to have exact the same colors on the terrain pieces that I also use for my miniatures. Okay, now to the painting part. I used dark sea blue from Vallejo for the stones. It's kind of a dark bluish grey, so it represents cold stones very nicely in my opinion. I dry brushed highlights by adding more and more white to the dark sea blue. I made sure to set relatively hard accents, so that there would be a great contrast in brightness. So really the dark grey on the one hand and the almost white highlights on the other hand. And of course I always made sure to dry brush mainly from top down, so from the direction the light comes from. And again consciously brushed the edges with hard highlights. I then used scorched brown for the wooden parts. This is really a beautiful dark brown in my opinion. I then highlighted it a little bit and dry brushed it. I then primed the sand surfaces with dark green. This is more or less the color tone that used to be called Dark Angels Green at Games Workshop. If a bit of static grass falls off in the end, you still have a green shade underneath. For the decoration I try to reflect a high diversity of different plants, as we know it from the forest for example. Then it looks a bit more realistic in my opinion. Here I used little tufts of static grass. They were glued down with PVA glue as usual. This moss effect might also be quite interesting. This is a trick that I once copied from Black Magic Craft. These are foam flakes mixed with PVA glue and water and then put on the piece with a tiny spatula. I also did this in episode 2 with the swamp zombies, so this is kind of the same technique. At first you think, oops, that looks pretty funny because it's still too light because of the PVA glue, but when it dries the flakes get their original color back. In addition the moss becomes bomb proof and provides more stability. You can also use the mixture to fill in gaps between the stones simply to make them more stable. You can also use the moss to cover up areas where you may have forgotten to apply the black primer. Oopsie! Then we also have normal static grass. I used two different colors for this, light green and dark green. I only glued the light green grass in some places with PVA glue to simulate the incidence of light and then filled the rest with dark green grass. So it looks as if you have a few light spots here and there where the light breaks through between the trees. And what surprised me and what I particularly like is this real moss here. I got it super cheap in a €1 shop for, let's guess, €1. I just took it with me to try it out. And again I just dipped the material in a PVA glue and water mixture, put it in the corners and it cured well. It can break off easily when dry, which is why I deliberately put it against the wall so it wouldn't break off so quickly. I think it is real moss, but probably artificial colored. I'm not sure. Because it is a natural material, East Peach looks different and, who would have thought it, realistic. What works well is that you can also depict vines growing up the walls. I'm curious to see how the moss looks when it stands around for a while, whether it loses its color, but I'm optimistic here because I think it's artificial colored. Oh, and again about the painting. At the very end I went over the piece again with brown and green washes to weather it a little more. Not everywhere, but here and there to get a little more diversity. When I was finished with the test piece, I thought to myself, come on, the leftovers you still have to be used now. And then, for example, this wall was created. The special thing here is that we also have a window where, for example, an archer can look through. The height also fits quite well. And here you can see again what I just meant, that you can use the moss to create beautiful tendrils to overgrow the ruins. What you could have done, and what I would like to try out on other pieces of terrain, is that you could decorate the piece further with roots and so on. and thus better represent the forest that is supposed to be around the pieces. Otherwise, that's it for now. I think the light effects look really good. All in all, I have to say that this is a direction that I quite like, and I'm looking forward to building somewhat larger pieces of terrain that are perhaps not quite as modular as this one. But I don't think you can go wrong with these first, more detailed terrain pieces. You can use them in any forest setting and put them always in between somehow, and what I would also like to do is to build everything a bit more angular. Here we only have straight walls for now. Okay, so much for that. Conclusion for me, it was fun and worked way better than I thought before. You just have to take your time, don't rush, just sit down and do some tinkering. Now let's take a look at the Northman Folk Rabble box. So, here we have our box of the Northman Folk Rabble from Fireforge games from the Forgotten World range. I got it very cheap for 16 euros, that means we have 18 figures in it, so one figure for less than 1 euro. I thought that was an unbeatable price. The idea was a little bit that you can also build civilians with it, which we also need for Rangers of Shadowdeep. Yes, I took a look at the box art, of course, quite nice. It looks a bit like the Corona demos here in Berlin. You can see it clearly, no minimum distance, no covering of the mouth and noses. The first thing that caught my eye was this axe. I thought, cool, there are axes involved, that fits in quite well with the forest theme. Yes, but then I took a look at the back. This axe is a bit misleading, I think, because we don't see any axes as weapons in the back. At least there's no two-hand axe involved in this set, only a single-handed one. Then we can take another look at the figures on the back. So, there's a bow in there, pitchforks, sickles of some kind. And back here you also see a lady, which I find particularly cool, and she is completely unarmed. She only carries a basket and nothing in the other hand. So you can really build civilians out of that. Then there's a torch, which is also very great, of course. That also fits my theme a bit, so I can play with fire effects. And of course, everyone is completely upset, angry and full of emotion. Probably because they read some shit on Facebook again. And now let's take a look at the figures. So, what have we got? 3 times the same sprue, which means I'll put the other 2 to one side. And also pretty cool Renedra bases, but both square and round. That means I can use the square bases for other projects like Kings of War Vanguard or something else. I also think it's nice that they are so flat. I know it's nothing special for many people, but I really like these aesthetics. Especially compared to the Games Workshop bases, which I think I've seen too many in my life. But let's just take a look at the sprue in detail. We have 6 figures in each. We see 3 and 3 here. Half of them are male and the other half are supposed to represent female bodies, I think. We have a large selection of heads, 15 heads for 6 figures, which means you can really build a lot of variations. We have 10 male heads and 5 female heads. I find the idea of equipping my ranger gang with them as well as the civilians particularly cool. And the idea is also to mix the bits a bit, since we have the same scale as the Frostgrave figures here. We also see some heads with hoods here, which of course goes well with the rangers. These will probably be the heads of my choice for my rangers. Otherwise, here are the peasant weapons and the field worker stuff. What I noticed a bit is that the figures have a little less detail than the Frostgrave kits, for example. but I'll have to look at everything again when it's painted. For me personally, it's not a necessary sign of quality if a figure has an incredible amount of detail. That's also my problem with many Games Workshop figures, for example. They have so many details that you first have to calm down the sculpt with the color. But that's all a matter of taste, of course. But here we really don't have many details. But hey, that's quite cool. I also like these longer jackets, they go well with the ranges. But as said, for the 16 euro that the box cost, you really can't complain. We also have 2 torches in here per sprue. So 6 torches in the whole box in total. I think torches and the light effects are pretty cool, but not every figure of the Ranger gang has to have a torch in his or her hand. The bow is also really cool because you get something for shooting in game. The other weapon options are also very cool, of course, especially for the civilians. For the members of my Ranger gang though, however, I will probably take the Frostgrave weapons, which I find more suitable than these pitchforks. By the way, I think the broom is one of the best parts of this box. Maybe I'll use it if I'll build a witch gang for Frostgrave one day. Yes, and that's pretty much it. Conclusion? Definitely not a bad buy. I'm looking forward to it, I'm curious to see what it looks like, and I find the possibility to build female figures especially cool. And especially female and male figures in one box. And of course it's easy to build unarmed figures and use them as civilians who then have a water bucket or a broom in their hands. All thumbs up. And my dear friends, that's it for episode 3, Road to Rangers of Shadowdeep. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a thumbs up or a subscription, that always makes me very happy. See you next time in episode 4 and bye!